Good evening. My name is Amy Martin, and today I'm going to be discussing one of my favorite young adult fiction books called The Curse of the Blue Figurine by John Bel Ayres. Accompanying this book are the two subsequent books from the series, which include The Mummy, The Wheel in the Crypt, and The Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull. I'm going to begin by drawing attention to the cover of this book. This eerie pen and ink drawing here was done by a master artist by the name of Edward Gorey. Many of you may know him, many of you may not. Along with this one, these covers are now very sought after by many people as collector's items. After Dial stopped publishing these books, the covers changed to these. Okay, I'll begin talking about this book and this series in particular. The Curse of the Blue Figurine was John Bel Ayres' 8th book. It was the beginning book that featured the protagonist, Johnny Dixon. Also, there is another protagonist by the name of Professor Roderick Childermus. And I'll begin by discussing the time period this book takes place in, the time in history, and how it compares to today. These books take place in the early 1950s, during the Korean War, where times were much different. Today, we live in a very fast-paced society. There's not a lot of time for family meals. People are basically running over top of each other to get to where they need to be. Times are very fast-paced, unlike the times featured in this book. The main female protagonist in this book is Kate Dixon, which is John Dixon's grandmother. She is very much a homemaker and centered around activities in the home. She is constantly cleaning and cooking. At the beginning of the book, it talks about Johnny being called to dinner from his favorite radio program to come and eat dinner at the table where his grandmother is serving dinner. And it talks about her being a fussy housekeeper. You definitely get that feel of Leave It to Beaver, Donna Reed type atmosphere. A very pleasant atmosphere of times gone by that we no longer live in, unfortunately. Another thing that someone could take note of easily, this book is very focused on the Catholic Church. This is pre-Vatican II Catholic Church, where you have the traditional altar, very beautiful style of worship. It features words like vestibule and sacristy. The sacristy is where Johnny finds the forbidden book and the figurine. That's another thing to take note of. I think that this is definitely a historical fiction, young adult type work that definitely needs to be explored. You know, all of these books are very, very entertaining. I think they would be very worthwhile for anyone to pick up and read. But I will begin by just talking about them at length. Mainly I'll be focusing on this one, The Curse of the Blue Figurine, and then I'll talk about these other two. Again, I wanted you to take a look at the eerie pen and ink illustrations by Edward Gorey. He's one of my favorite artists. And I'll begin by telling you about this book. Again, as you can see, the book is called The Curse of the Blue Figurine. It states here underneath the author's name that he also wrote The House with a Clock in Its Walls, and as far as a testament to how popular this author was and how talented a storyteller he was, The House with a Clock in Its Walls, recently, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that book was made into a movie. That was the series featuring Louis Barnevelt and Jonathan Barnevelt and Florence Zimmerman. That featured Jack Black and Cate Blanchett. This is not the same series. This is the series, as I stated, that features Johnny Dixon and Professor Childermus as the two main protagonists. There is another series that Mr. Bellairs wrote featuring a young man called Anthony Monday and the protagonist Myra Eels. If you ever want to check those out, The Dark Secret of Weatherend, The Treasure of Alphaeus Winterborn, and The Lamp from the Warlock's Tomb, they're basically Gothic type mysteries like these, but my favorites are the Johnny Dixons. I'll begin to tell you what this book is about. I chose to do my presentation mainly on this book. It's very entertaining. I think the storytelling is very good. It's a page turner. It keeps you focused from beginning to end. It takes place in a town called Dustin Heights in Massachusetts, and I believe that Dustin Heights is a fictional town based on Bellairs' town where he lived and where he passed away, called Haverhill, Massachusetts. It's a little small New England town, very picturesque. In this series, it takes place in New England, and many times they travel throughout New England on their harrowing adventures. In this book, Johnny Dixon has just lost his mother to cancer, and his father is off fighting in the Korean War, and that means that Johnny is staying with his grandparents, Henry and Kate Dixon. As I stated, this is very 1950s, picturesque type family atmosphere where the woman of the home, she is definitely very house proud. She keeps her house tidy. She's very homemaker oriented, cares for her husband, cares for her grandson, is constantly cooking and taking care of the house, very matronly. Johnny is not a football star, poster boy type of child. He's very intellectual. He enjoys reading about ancient civilizations, particularly ancient Egypt. He's very cerebral. He wears glasses. I guess the old cliche, a nerd, maybe may be attributed to him. That's one of the things that drew me to these books many years ago. I was always an eyeglass wearer and tended to be more solitary and more into intellectual pursuits than other types of things. The plot begins to thicken on a snowy night when Professor Childermus and Grandpa Dixon must try to rescue the professor's car that has gotten stuck in the snow. Johnny's grandpa, Henry, helps Professor Childermus, Roderick Childermus is his full name, try to get his car unstuck, and when they finally become weary of this pursuit, the two men decide to come in and get some refreshments. The professor agrees to some brandy, and he insists on some homemade fudge that Kate has made, and that's where, when they're sitting at the kitchen table, the professor discovers Johnny's interest in reading. And this is where the plot starts to thicken, when he finds out that Johnny's interested in ghosts, and he's interested in the history of his church, St. Michael's Parish, that is located in Dustin Heights, where he and his grandparents attend, as well as the professor. The conversation then shifts over toward a spirit that is supposed to haunt the church. It is the spirit of a deceased priest, a very nasty priest, by the name of Reminus Bart, who was supposedly into some unsavory things like black magic and sorcery, and supposedly was responsible for the deaths of a few people that he did not particularly care for. So this was not a very nice man. We gather that he wasn't a very nice, compassionate person. Somebody that definitely should not have been in a priestly type or clerical occupation. And it is reputed that his ghost still haunts this establishment, and he can be seen on the grounds, particularly the sacristy of the parish called St. Michael's. The following day, Johnny, when he's at school, after he heard the professor's tale, he finds himself in the midst of the school bully, a big farm boy by the name of Eddie Tomke. Now, Eddie Tomke is the school bully, and unfortunately, he's harrowed in on Johnny Dixon because he's very jealous of him due to his academic ability, and his intelligence, by his ability to make good grades, because Eddie Tompkins' abilities do not lie in scholastic arts, obviously. He's more of a farm boy. He's more for hard work. You get the feeling he's bitter about this, and that's why he's jealous of Johnny. Johnny finds himself kindly being cornered by Eddie Tompkins, and he doesn't want to deal with him, so he decides to take a detour and go into the local parish in St. Michael's, and he finds himself in the sacristy, where he discovers this grimy book that's covered with cobwebs, where inside of it is hollowed out. There's a figurine, and inside of it is a warning that if whoever decides to remove this statue, they do so at their own peril, the book and the figurine itself. That it's definitely forbidden to do so, that something bad is going to happen to the person who takes it on themselves to remove these items. Well, Johnny disobeys the warning and brings home the book covered with cobwebs. The book is very dirty. He has to hide it from his grandmother, because his grandmother is a very meticulous housekeeper. And he decides to remove the figurine and begin exploring it of his own volition. And the figurine, pardon my cat here, that figurine is actually called a Ustabi. That is an Egyptian figurine. The professor and Johnny speculate about the authenticity of the figurine throughout the novel, but at the end they find out that it is indeed an actual Egyptian artifact that the evil priest had in his possession. The figurine, there is a story, an Egyptian myth attached to the figurine. It's like a slave or some kind of soldier that is placed inside of a mummified mummy or Pharaoh king's tomb to assist him in the netherworld as he ventures across the river Nile to go to the netherworld. Very interesting. These books are filled with facts that are steeped in mythology and history, and it's not in a dry textbook type fashion that you're exposed to these facts. It's cleverly interwoven into a very intriguing, fast-paced tale. That's one thing I need to remark on. You learn history in a very interesting way. The figurine, as I stated, was indeed cursed. Some occult power was attached to it that Johnny uses to later on in the story ward off the bully. At first, the figurine and the power is beneficial to him, but later on he is starting to discover that all that glitters is not gold, so to speak. Things begin to take a more sinister turn. As the novel progresses, spiders begin to appear in his grandmother's kitchen. And one night, when he visits church to light a candle for his departed mother, Johnny encounters a strange man who calls himself Mr. Beard, and he begins a conversation with Johnny, and Johnny thinks he's amiable, and he presents Johnny a ring. However, this Mr. Beard, the name Mr. Beard is just a pseudonym for Father Bart. This is just an incarnation of the evil priest that is trying to win control over Johnny to enter back in the world of the living. And as I stated, Johnny took the book and the figurine, and this is what is leading to this incident, where the occult power is winning control over Johnny through the evil priest spirit that wants to regain control of Johnny to re-enter the world of the living and cause more mischief. Meanwhile, the professor and Johnny have developed a friendship, somewhat close. He enjoys chess games with the professor and homemade cakes after school in the evenings. They have heart-to-heart talks. They talk about history, and Johnny's learned a few fascinating facts about the figurine, but at the time they don't think it's an authentic Egyptian piece of art or an authentic Egyptian relic. Johnny's fascination and fear of the legendary Father Bart at St. Michael's Church is starting to aggravate the professor. He begins to regret telling him the story. He thinks that Johnny may be hallucinating, that he needs to see a hypnotist or a psychiatrist. But there is, in fact, something going on a preternatural, paranormal level that is tormenting Johnny. And the professor's not seeing that yet. He notices the changes in Johnny, that he's getting more depressed, more withdrawn, and he decides after the doctor visit to Dr. Schrimmerhorn to take Johnny on an excursion to New Hampshire, maybe to regroup. And as they slumber in a hotel suite, it is there that Father Bart comes for Johnny on his final conquest. And it is now the professor finally sees that Johnny is telling the truth, that there is something going on a very sinister level. The book ends with a final showdown high up in the mountains where the evil priest's ashes are finally destroyed. Thereby, he can no longer win entrance into the world of the living and torment Johnny. At the end of the book, I know I mentioned earlier that the figurine is in fact an ancient Egyptian relic, and Professor Charlie Coote, one of the lesser known characters that usually is introduced at the end of a novel to explain the mysteries, like at the Scooby-Doo novels where the lady with the glasses will finally explain, or Daphne will explain at the end of Scooby-Doo who the real culprit was. Well, that's kind of what Dr. Charles Coote does. He explains everything, and he's supposedly an expert on the occult and on mythology and folklore, and he later explains at the end of the book that the figurine was in fact real. So that's the end of the Curse of the Blue Figurine, and I strongly recommend that you pick this up and read it. We're nearing Halloween time, and it's something that's very entertaining, and it's wholesome on a level. If you like the Last Apprentice series by Joseph Delaney, or you like Harry Potter, or you like Mary Downing Hahn, or you like R.L. Stine, I think you would enjoy these books. Now, I'll talk briefly about the second one here. This is an Edward Gorey illustration, and I'm sorry, my toddler got a hold of this a few years ago, and it's suffered a little damage, as you can see. But The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt is this one, and here on the cover is Johnny Dixon, and this statue of this knight, this big statue-esque cement knight here, is supposed to represent Geoffrey de Bullion, where the Glomus estate will is supposedly hidden inside this statue. This is the second book in the Johnny Dixon series. This is the book where we're introduced to Byron Ferguson. That is a friend around Johnny's age that he meets at Boy Scout camp. And it's in this book that Johnny and Fergie begin their journey on the Glomus estate, and they must look for a lost will containing $10,000. This is the book where Johnny's grandmother has been diagnosed with a brain tumor. Johnny's trying to find the $10,000. His grandmother gets the surgery and she gets better, but he doesn't find the $10,000 till the end of the book, when it's presented to him as a check. Johnny is on a harrowing adventure where he has to battle supernatural evil forces and evil doings by Miss Woodley. She wants the will too, and she's somehow related to the Glomus man who had a lot of money, and he has to take her on, and she's a very nasty character. As I said, the Geoffrey de Bullion statue was where the will was hidden, but it was destroyed. The walls of the Glomus estate caved in, and later on there was a fire, and the will was destroyed in that statue, along with the statue itself. But at the end, Grandma Dixon's health is restored, and it's a happy ending. Johnny's presented the $10,000 by a relative of Mr. Glomus, and that'll take us to the next book here. This is The Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull. This is a very good book. The cover art here is not done by Mr. Gorey, but I will present to show you the clock here. This is Mr. Gorey's art on the frontispiece, and this is supposedly the Childermas clock, and this is where the plot begins to thicken here when Professor Childermus and Johnny are staying up in New Hampshire, and they discover this long-lost clock. That inside of it there is an item that is cursed that sets the story in motion. Okay, in this third installment of the Johnny Dixon series, he and his friend the Professor take a trip to New Hampshire during the winter. And soon after, Johnny Dixon and Professor Childermus cross paths with the long-lost Childermus clock, and the Professor explores the old clock, accidentally touching the tiny skull, setting a curse in motion which leads to the Professor's disappearance. The St. Michael's priest, Father Thomas Higgins, who's discussed briefly, you're introduced to him briefly in the other books. He's far more involved in this book. Johnny and Fergie and the priest have to go on a harrowing adventure up on the islands of Maine to rescue their friend. And they finally locate the Professor, and they're able to stop the curse and bring him home. This is a very good book, very entertaining as the other two are. I highly recommend these books. Thank you for listening to my lecture. Give these a try. I highly recommend them. Peace and love to everyone, and thanks for listening to my talk.